are the co-founders of Dipper.
Dipper is a technology platform that guides professionals of color to a better workplace, one review at a time.
Dipper is your safe space. It is the time for you to share your voice with a community that you are a part of. Visit us and join today at ourdipper.com.
Welcome, everyone, to ourdipper.com. Goodness, this month is a good month because guess what month it is? Can anyone guess? Narges, Jacinta?
We made it.
We made it. And it is International Women's Month. So we are celebrating this entire month, and we are excited to be partnering with Womankind to have ongoing discussion. So it's going to be an incredible month, everyone. But this week, we are talking about the myth of the model minority and the mission of Womankind. And today we have an incredible guest speaker with us, Narges. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. You know, I have to brag about you just for a little bit. So Narges is the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer of MINTS, a full service Am Law 100 law firm with over 1,200 employees and serving clients worldwide. As the Chief Diversity Officer, Narges is in charge of assessing company culture and implementing thoughtful and innovative steps to foster respect across differences so that all employees are fully engaged and empowered to succeed and lead. But get this, I'm not done with her yet. Narges is also currently board chair of Womankind, a New York City-based nonprofit addressing gender-based violence. It is dear and near to Dipper and Jacinta and I, and we are so excited to have you here today.
I'm so excited to be here. Really, thank you.
You're welcome.
Wonderful. Awesome. That was a great intro, Netta. And we would love to learn a little bit more about what is the mission of Womankind. And if you could just share a bit about the organization, that would be great.
Yeah. So as Netta mentioned, Womankind is a New York City-based organization, and we work on addressing gender-based violence. That's generally domestic violence, human trafficking, and sexual violence. And we work with all populations, but we specialize in working with Asian and Pacific Islander immigrant women in the New York City area and up and down the East Coast. Our mission is to use the multi-dimensionality of our Asian heritage to work alongside survivors of gender-based violence as they build a pathway to healing. And we help by giving survivors the ability to find and use the tools that they need to overcome violence and healing. So we work, our counselors work in 18 different languages, Asian languages, plus of course English and Spanish. And we're based in New York City with headquarters in Manhattan. We have 2 residential shelters in New York City, and then we also have 3 community offices in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Queens.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And I love the work that Womankind is doing. And like you said, I just kind of want to re-amplify. They serve survivors of gender-based violence, including domestic violence, which is so important. Human trafficking, which I just feel needs even more coverage, and sexual violence. And what was striking is in over 18 Asian languages and dialects, as well as Spanish and of course English. I think that's just amazing. Thank you so much for the work that you do. But I want to be a little bit nosy here. So how did you get involved?
It's a good question. So I'm an attorney, and decades ago, as a very, very young corporate litigator in New York, I worked on a pro bono case that involved a domestic violence survivor who was living in a Womankind shelter and getting services from Womankind. She was from Pakistan, like me. I'm Pakistani. And she had suffered horrendous abuse from her husband and her mother-in-law and father-in-law and her brother-in-law for years. But then she gave birth to a baby girl. And she decided that she had to leave him for the sake of her child and for her own sake, really. And that's when I met her. And she spoke no English. She had no ability to navigate her way around New York City. She'd been kept locked up in an apartment the whole time she'd been in the US. She had no job, no resources. She had only a primary education. And she was really suffering from all the trauma that had been inflicted on her for years. You know, she was sort of a shell of a person. And I worked with her on her legal issues for about 3 years. But during that time, she was working with the counselors at Womankind. And during that process, over the course of 3 years, I really saw this like incredible transformation. It's hard to sort of describe because it happened slowly over a period of years, but you know, she went from not being able to leave the shelter without her guidance counselor by her side to she got a job, she learned English, she got out of shelter, she found herself an apartment, she was whizzing around Manhattan in the subway. She'd become just this like incredible, engaged and devoted mother and an advocate for her child. And so I got to see firsthand, witness I had the privilege of witnessing this incredible work that Womankind's counselors were able to do. And that transformation was something that I wanted to continue to support and be a part of. So instead of continuing to work on advocacy for one person at a time, you know, I decided to jump in and work on like sort of the issues more broadly by joining the board.
Wow. So powerful. Thank you so much. I love to hear you kind of talking about the transformation that you're able to see. And just knowing that that woman was able to reclaim her power after going through such trauma,
yes,
is something that's so moving. And I can see why you would say, oh my goodness, I have to be a part of the work that Womankind is doing. Such a blessing.
Truly.
Yeah, and you probably feel like a tremendous responsibility in making their mission your mission. And it's such a powerful one, and that it's impacting so many lives. So again, like, we're so glad that you're here. And one topic that it's funny, I not until recently understood the concept of, but there's definitely this myth of the model minority. And like, how do you feel this plays into the work of Womankind?
It's a great question. So I'm just going to take a quick step back to sort of contextualize, right? So the model minority myth, for those who don't know, is this stereotype and trope about Asian Americans. And it goes something like this. Asian Americans are great at math, and they all play the violin and cello, and they're really smart, and they're well educated. And Asian American Pacific Islander women are obedient, and they're subservient, and they're passive. They never ask for help. They keep their heads down. Another trope that's been gaining popularity, right, is that they're crazy rich. Asians are crazy rich. They don't need help from the government. They don't need social services of any kind. And if they're victimized, then, you know, so be it. They don't really get the services that they need. And so because of these tropes and stereotypes, we've seen violence against the API community, and it's not taken seriously, and it's not always pursued or properly investigated. And we've seen this play out over and over again in American history. You know, just a quick example, in the 1980s, Vincent Chin was murdered in Michigan. He was a Chinese American, and two laid off automobile factory workers came across him and beat him into a coma. And then he ultimately died from his injuries a few days later. And they beat him up because they believed that their jobs as factory workers in the automobile industry had gone away to Japan, and that somehow, I guess they thought Vincent Chin was Japanese, or they didn't really care. He was just sort of the convenient scapegoat. And regardless, they demonized him because of his ethnicity, and they killed him. And they were found guilty, but the judge wouldn't impose a sentence on them because the judge really related to the perpetrators, not the victims. And he felt that the murderers had families to feed, and so they shouldn't be locked up in jail for very long. And what they wrote out completely was the victim. And I think it happened because he was Asian American and the judge couldn't relate to him in the same way that he did to the perpetrators. And you saw this again after the mass shootings in Atlanta, right? I mean, the sheriff said that so many people were killed because the shooter was having a bad day. Again, he was relating to the perpetrator, and the victims, who were largely Asian American, became faceless, voiceless, non-existent. They were just written out of the narrative and they were disregarded. So yes, the model minority myth is deeply problematic in many ways, in no small part because, it completely writes off an entire community. And at Womankind, we are working hard to change that in a variety of ways, to change how the API community is perceived and also to fight back.
Yeah. And I like that you all are trying to shift that narrative. We saw how gruesome the narrative was, especially around the era of coronavirus, which was very recent.
Yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
The narrative that was being pushed out and how much Asian hate then was even amplified. And when we kind of go back to that model minority myth, it's so traumatizing as well because it then impacts one's career. It impacts the gap of that individual because
it's inducing violence in some scenarios. Yeah.
Well, because then you have people then thinking, well, here's a cheap source of labor, right? Smart, efficient, quick, submissive, and that type of bias that's skewed then impacts one's livelihood. So I always tell people, really think about the impact that has on someone's life. And again, I'm just so thankful for the work that Womankind is doing in shifting the narrative and helping also, women experience domestic violence, human trafficking, sexual violence. So important. As a DEI leader in law, how have you seen the environment change? And how does that inform you to continue to work with Womankind?
We're getting close to time, so I'll just mention one thing. There are strong parallels between corporate DEI work and the work we do at Womankind to help our survivors. So after George Floyd's murder, we saw this rush to advocate for a number of things: better policing, correcting some of the historic wrongs that have been inflicted for hundreds of years on our Black colleagues and friends. And similarly, after the Atlanta shootings and the attacks on Asian American men and women on the streets of San Francisco and New York, there was a rush to advocate for the AAPI community. But for a lot of people, these were a flash in the pan. It wasn't about the sustained, really hard work that it takes to create systemic change, right? And so we're seeing that in DEI work in corporate America. We see a retrenching, diversity fatigue has set in. People aren't nearly as vocal in their support for righting the historical wrongs as they were before. And we see that in the API work and in gender-based violence work as well. The momentum is slowing down and interest is waning a little bit. So I would say that we have to really strongly guard against that. We have to continue to stand up for what we believe in, continue to build a movement, continue to advocate for those who are the most vulnerable.
Yeah, so important. I call it the trend-based advocacy. Like, can we just put a pause to the trend-based advocacy?
Yeah.
Right? Like, these are issues that have been existing for such a long time. And so we have to stay on top of it, right? Because it's so important for us to dismantle. We can't just like take a look, pay attention to it, for a small amount of time and then move on to the next. It's still existing and impacting people's lives.
It has to be sustained work, right? Because systemic change isn't going to happen just by going to a couple of rallies and holding up a placard. There's a lot. It goes a lot deeper.
And I think it's how you brought up the concept of diversity fatigue and how are we combating that? And it's amazing. And just like some of it is just telling the stories and then like sharing the narratives and experiences of some of the diverse groups that are being impacted through this like discrimination and being isolated. So it's great that you're sharing like very personal stories, but they're real. And I'm sure people can relate to them.
Yeah.
I see in the comments as well. So thank you for that. And Narges, what do you want people to take away from just this introduction to Womankind, to just really understanding the mission and how you're protecting women and bringing visibility to what they're facing throughout the world? What would you like them to take away here today?
Well, one of the things we just talked about, right? Whether you're involved in social justice issues that gained momentum after George Floyd's murder, or you're interested in disrupting gender-based violence, stay the course. These are marathon movements, they're not sprints, right? And then really get involved at the grassroots level of any movement that resonates with you. For me, it's Womankind, it's gender-based violence, it's violence against the AAPI community. And at Womankind, we have volunteer opportunities for people to be involved. We, so that they can be part of the movement against gender-based violence. We have children's programs. We have adult literacy programs, financial literacy programs. If you can offer support for those, that would be great. But I want to say for those who can afford it, also invest in your nonprofits at the grassroots level. Give money, because that's what funds the salaries of the amazing counselors who are creating transformational change. It helps keep the lights on at our community shelters and offices. It helps to buy Metro cards for survivors so that they can travel to their therapy appointments and so that they can go to court when they need to. So if you can, donate your time, donate your money, and really invest in the core causes that you care about and the movements that you care about.
I love that. Thank you so much, Narges, for your time. I can't believe we are already out of time.
Time flies.
But thank you so much for those practical steps that people can take. You can invest your time, you can invest resources, and you can invest your funds as well. So I thank everyone that is participating right now. Folks want to know, hey, how can they, get going and really drive the impact along with you, Narges? For those of you that are tuning in, as always, head to ourdipper.com right now. We want to hear from you. We want to hear how you're going to be supporting Womankind. Get involved, right? Connect with Narges as well. But this has been a pleasure speaking with you. And thank you so much for the insight that you've provided today.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it, and really appreciate all the work you're doing in amplifying all those voices. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Take care.